Hi and welcome to Boston Media Theory. I'm Marcus Breen and we're here as usual to talk about what's happening in and around town, in and around Boston and I guess greater metropolitan Boston. Tonight I'm delighted to welcome Peter Miller, who is, let's say, a community activist in the technology field, a journalist, and if it's fair to say, a product of the History of Consciousness program at the UC Santa Cruz. Right? Got the wrong Santa. At least I didn't say Santa Claus, right? So can you tell us, it's a fairly well-known organisation or group within the university system in California and made some huge contributions. What would you say is its orientation and relevance to our interest in critical theory and in technology?
Sure. Well, first I want to thank you very much for inviting me to the program. I'm certainly pleased to talk about my Santa Cruz time and the history of consciousness, a kind of interesting program in itself. There's sort of like three of them that are kind of like this across the country. One in Brandeis and in Chicago, kind of history of ideas program. The Santa Cruz program is a little more eclectic, and I actually ended up going there because I had started my graduate career at UC Berkeley in '67 and '8, which was a pretty exciting time to be there. And I went to Berkeley because I ended up having three generations of political theory teachers who were sort of all involved with Oberlin and Berkeley. There was kind of a connection with all of them, and I left after 1 year. I mean, I got caught up in sex, drugs, and rock and roll at Berkeley at the time, and came to Boston for three years. Worked in a mental hospital, met my wife there, and went to Santa Cruz because there was a purge in Berkeley, and the political theory people at Berkeley, two of the main ones, John Schaar and Sheldon Wolin, went to Santa Cruz to start a new political theory program there. And the plan was to start as part of the History of Consciousness program and then develop a social and political theory program out of that. The program ended up not happening, unfortunately, because Sheldon Wolin went to Princeton. But it was both lucky and unlucky for me that it worked out that way, because I didn't finish my dissertation at the time or with any kind of regularity. I got to what was called the ABD level. That's all but dissertation.
Yes. And
it wasn't until 35 years later that I sort of had an epiphany about wanting to finish things. This being the History of Consciousness program, even though there was very good continuity between my initial work in John Dewey and political theory, because for the next 35 years I had essentially done community technology work. I was able to change my dissertation topic to political theory and community technology. And I'm frequently introduced in places as one of the few people in the country who has a dissertation in that field.
Well, we can talk quite a lot about that, and I also want to point out, just for the sake of making it patently obvious, that it's always valuable, I think, to have a clear understanding of not only how we're historically located, but where some of the great adaptations and survival stories have happened in the field of both critical work and also technology studies, and I suppose especially the West Coast of the United States. And you mentioned Boston, and I suppose between those two hubs, Silicon Valley, Stanford, Berkeley, and then Boston, really represent two of the focal points, do they not, for technology?
They do, they do. And I have to confess that there was very little of the technology, and at the point where I left Santa Cruz and and Silicon Valley in the Bay Area in essentially 1977, and I wasn't really involved in that until I came back to Boston.
With a Hewlett Packard.
77, 78. Although I do have to say that it was my political theory orientation that really, informed and still informs today a lot of my work in the field of community media and technology.
Right, and it would have been in 1977. I can't remember when Hewlett Packard or whoever it was working in their garage. It is sometimes seen as the mythological beginnings of Silicon Valley, but it was certainly sometime around then, was it not?
It was.
Yeah.
It was.
Yeah. Did you ever see the garage?
No, I didn't. I haven't.
So let's talk a bit about this idea of political theory and community technology, and why it might be important, given your own experience of it and your observations. What is it that perhaps mobilises you and has been the sort of focus, or was the focus of your research in that great circle you've just described of 35 years of starting and then reinvigorating yourself to, very gratefully to all of us, complete a good research project as a dissertation? What are the points there?
Well, the Berkeley School of Political Theory, just to explain a little bit about what that is for those who know political theory and its various schools, I think one of the ways of describing it is it's left-wing Straussianism. And what that means for those who aren't familiar with Leo Strauss and some of his students and the conservative school of political theory that evolved with that, is that the Berkeley School and its teachers share with Straussianism a reliance and place a high value on essentially the great books, the great texts of political theory, and one studies and grasps political theory through the great tradition, beginning with with the Greeks on through the moderns, and in the United States with the Puritans and the founding. And one of the other things that the Berkeley School shares with the Straussian School is a reliance and care for the kind of language that puts a premium on concerns about authority and legitimacy, and themes that are particularly frequently associated with conservatism. And the interesting thing, of course, about all these things was that in 1967 and 8, at the height of the Berkeley Rebellion, it was the Berkeley School that defended the rebellion and that was strong supporters of it, and they did so on these traditional grounds. They did so in terms of participation and a care for democracy and a regard for the Constitution and the Declaration, and that kind of conservative radicalism has really informed all my, political work and involvement in community technology activism since almost immediately since I came to Boston.
Right. My understanding is that you inverted the conservatism, or you didn't maintain or practice that conservatism. Is that correct? The Straussian conservatism.
Well,
you took it and identified what was relevant.
Identified on the left in the same way that the whole movement, both the students and the faculty in political theory in Berkeley, defended the student movement and the rebellion and the anti-war movement, and beginning with the free speech movement through all the activity that took place in Berkeley and that we associate with Berkeley in the 60s.
Yes. What was the point, if there was one that you can identify, where the concept of community became privileged or became central to your understanding of?
Well, that was one of those basic sort of concepts that goes along with authority and legitimacy. The fact that one is a member of a community, that one's citizenship and one's membership in that community is it's a strong teaching of the Berkeley School that's really that's where we find our deepest personal identities in that membership and that citizenship, and that's one of the things that put such a premium on community as one of the most meaningful orientations of the Berkeley School.
One has to be also fairly careful to identify the fact that, as with many of these terms, they are given a particular meaning depending on how they're organised and managed within the discourse.
That's true.
So the word community can be used in a very negative way in terms of any kind of progressive or left politics to suggest exclusion, to suggest the privileging of particular races.
Well,
and so on. So
if we're to move over to talk about like the arena, the field of community technology,
sure, let's do
community media and technology, one of the things that we could say about that, in the same way that the Berkeley School sort of defines a lot of particular political terms, is that there's a family of associations. I mean, the field of community technology, community media and technology, is not a hard and fast, single stream. It's really sort of quite eclectic, and there are different pieces and different streams of it. So that the interesting thing to me about my career and the things I fell into when I came to Boston was how many different pieces of rivulets of that stream there were to be involved with, and how many I had a pretty amazing opportunities to get involved with on the ground floor, because a lot of development of community technology in the Boston area, as in the country, it's the late '80s and the early '90s was the time when a lot of that just exploded in major ways.
Yeah. Well, it's worth thinking about and reminding ourselves that we're recording this in a community television or cable channel studio here in Newton, Massachusetts. And I suppose it was after 1975 or thereabouts that cable started coming in, and the federal government insisted that the tax go to local governments to fund these organisations, right?
Well, that was certainly the whole PEG access movement was, that really sort of began, was one of the early leaders in the whole development of community technology. And that's why I in some ways use the term community technology. Community media and technology really, they go together quite closely. And in fact, the whole development of, on one hand, community technology centers and community media centers. In fact, the concept community technology center evolved in the early '90s. It was originally, these creatures were called community computing centers.
Okay.
And part of the reason for calling them and changing the name as the national organization became the Community Technology Centers Network, part of the reason for changing that name was because we saw a convergence of community media centers and community computing centers. And in some way, the word Community Technology Center was meant to be an overarching sort of name and acronym that pulled them all together. And when you look at the history of the development of community technology, community media and technology in the Boston area, you see the intertwining of both community technology centers and community media centers as sort of two of the major impulses of that really forged a major part of the stream of community technology in early '90s and thereafter.
So I'm familiar with the community media, so we're watching a television screen and we're have cameras in front of us and we have the usual processes of production.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and now, of course, with everything being converged into digital technology, there's not a lot of, it's somewhat difficult to distinguish media from technology, as you've suggested. But what can you tell us about community technology centres? I mean, what did they look like, and what did they seek to do?
Okay.
Were they connected directly to the early stages of computerization, for example?
Yeah. Well, I was fortunate enough to sort of fall into while doing some other community technology work. In fact, there was a point where I helped set up a network of 4 community desktop publishing centers in Boston. One of which was associated with the Community Action Agency of Somerville. And the person who was in charge of that, a guy by the name of Dale Patterson, said, "Hey, since you're so interested in this, there's another technology project we're involved with. It's called Playing to Win at Scale, the Somerville Center for Adult Learning Experiences. And you ought to come get involved with it." And what Playing to Win was the second community computing center that we know was set up in this country. The first one being set up in 1981 in a public housing basement by a woman by the name of Antonia Tony Stone, who in 1981, now think back, the state of computers in 1981,
wow.
But she foresaw that computers were going to become a major social force in not only in our country, but across the world.
Was she in Boston?
Well, she was initially in New York, and then she moved to Boston. She moved to Somerville, and having started this center that was designed to sort of teach people computers, how to use them, and have access to them, primarily to populations that didn't have ordinary access. She worked with prisoners. She worked with low literacy populations. She worked with non-English speaking people. And as I said, this first center was set up in a public housing basement in East Harlem in 1981. And when she came to Boston in the late 80s, she wanted to set up another similar kind of center because she saw that the way that people who didn't have access to technology were going to get that access was through the development of centers.
No.
And the interesting thing is not only did these centers explode, I mean, the growth of them was phenomenal. And as I said, I was lucky to, fortunate to be in on the ground floor. But at one point, and they came to be sort of the defining institution to meet the problem of what was called the digital divide. Okay. That was the language that used to be used. And I have to say that so what happened is the Somerville Center started. I can explain a little bit of how it worked and how it helped people who didn't otherwise have access to technology. But another 7 or 8 or 9 centers followed in the Boston area. And there were some major grants that got developed, and there was a network called the Playing to Win Network that got funded in the early 90s that became transformed into something called the Community Technology Centers Network, which grew to have over 1,000 members. And in fact, there was a database that the Digital Divide Network, because there was a lot of activity in early mid-90s to deal with the problem of the digital divide. And at one point, the Digital Divide Network, toward the end of the 90s, had a database where you could put in your zip code, and it was filled with 20,000 community technology centers. Now, certainly true that a good number of these were libraries that did not have the kind of staffing that's one of the hallmarks of community technology centers. But still, I mean, there was a growth, and it was Tony Stone's vision to try to say this world. And interestingly enough, when I say this world, because the development of centers is something that happened across the globe. When the problem of the digital divide, which was an international problem, became recognized, one of the basic approaches to dealing with that problem was to set up centers that had different names, cyber centers. You know, there was a variety of them, but there's a whole international movement to develop these kinds of centers too. And that association, that network, gradually disappeared, but in the early 90s, the whole question was, because while independent centers got set up by, like the Playing to Win Center in East Harlem, most of them were like the ones at scale. They were associated with social service agencies that built them, because it was social service agencies. Scale is a good example. Adult literacy, daycare programs, senior programs, literacy programs, business training programs. Here were computers coming in, and it was these organizations that had to understand, what do we do? What do we do? What kind of computers do we get? What kind of software do we get? How do we teach people? What kind of programs do we develop?
So it sounds to me, Peter, like this is a very local, perhaps these days we would say hyper-local activity. Was it generally connected to local governments? Or
well,
even
local governments made,
scale?
you know, certainly there was movement in Boston for local governments to be supportive. In Boston also there was something that got developed in the, I believe it started in the mid-90s, called the Timothy Smith Network. That sort of defined itself in terms of the old Roxbury. And so there were, very early on, there was a network, and if you go to the TimothySmithNetwork.org now, you'll see an impressive 1.5, 2 centers that were set up primarily for for people of color.
Oh, really?
That have a whole network of centers that played a very important role in the development of computer literacy in the Boston area.
That's amazing. If you go to the Boston Public Library now, and you know, a couple of years ago, probably 2016 or 17, they completed a very big extension. And if you go into that extension, there's a lot of terminals. And the times I've been there, every one of those terminals is used.
Now technology's changed, so they don't have, you know, the kind of training and support and people who use them, you know, for the most part, do so because they know how to use that technology. But initially, the emphasis was on the kinds of programs that you need to train people on how to use those. Okay. And still with advanced technology, that still is the case. Yeah. And so that mission has also been taken over by a good number of the PEG access centers.
Right?
So not only are they teaching people how to make their own videos, but I mean, as part of doing that, because of the convergence of technology, that's why there's been a convergence of the kinds of centers that have supported people in their communities in trying to develop a range of technology and media skills.
Right. Well, I've noticed we've got about 5 minutes left or less than that, and this is a wonderful history lesson as well as a terrific sort of expose, if you like, of things to do with technology, particularly computerization and communication, that we don't normally hear about, folk that are underserviced. especially because of their poverty or whatever other kinds of social and political challenges there are in our society. And it seems to me that there's a very powerful idea here about how communication connects with a form of democracy that is uniquely American in the sense in which it is premised on the idea of giving individuals the capacity to make some decisions about themselves and to organise themselves. Would that be a fair summation, like political aspect of it?
That's certainly a fair statement, and I'd certainly urge you or anyone who's interested, to take a look at, the materials on my website at peterbmiller.wordpress.com. But at the mission statement and the philosophy behind the setting up of these centers is very much along the lines of what you just said.
Great. We've got a couple of minutes, and that is, in that time I want to just ask you a little bit about the connection that you have with technology centers in Cuba and what's happened there, what kind of formation there is. I know it's unfair to ask you that with a minute to go, but what's happened there?
Okay, well, I became interested. I mean, I'm sort of a newbie in my involvement with Cuba projects. Although it's been one of my main involvements for the last 5 years. It moved up from my B to my A list on December 17th. 2014, when President Obama and President Castro, had the historic agreement, and I sort of had a number of fortunate opportunities to become involved with Cuba, and there's a whole range of sort of technology issues. But one of the interesting things about Cuba is, like so many other countries in the world, that they have set up a network, particularly of youth centers, Hoven clubs they're called, so that there was a development of these centers in Cuba parallel to the kinds of development that took place in the United States. And the interesting thing about the Cuban centers that I visited is that they are nationally funded and staffed. So unlike a lot of centers or libraries that may have equipment but not staff, the centers in Cuba have 7 or 8 staff members and small centers, so that it's one of the ways in which the government's been serious about sort of equalizing opportunities for their countrymen and women and youth, that in some ways is a model across the world. And when you combine that with the fact that Cuba's official platform is open source, and look at some of the pretty amazing technology developments that have been made in Cuba, particularly around the health field, it's an interesting arena for us to become acquainted and involved with.
Well, let's leave it there because our time is up. Thank you so much. That's Peter B. Miller at, what is the website again?
It's .wordpress.com.
peterbmiller.wordpress.com for lots more information, and it's really left me with a desire to know a lot more. So thank you for that wonderful history and those insights about technology and communication and indeed community development. And so that's all from me, from Marcus Breen and Boston Media Theory. Until next time, keep on mediaing. Good night.